Hello, everyone. This is Gabriel. I'm really excited to have a chance to speak in this episode about the second edition of a book that I've written called The Emergence of Islam. I'll be having a discussion with a friend and a co-worker on this project, Hassan Ahmed. So, yeah, hi, Hassan.
Hi, Gabriel. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, great to have this chance to speak together about the book. Um, Everyone, Hassan is a graduate student currently at Harvard University. You could say more about this, but working generally in Islamic studies, a graduate of Princeton as for his undergraduate studies. He helped me work on the second edition of this book. So this book was published earlier and was used by many as a textbook. And then we added some exciting new features for the second edition, which was just recently published. So we'll be speaking about that. We'll be speaking generally about what this book does that other books don't, and then what is the value added in the second edition. So yeah, so we'll have some time to chat about that. Also, this will be interesting for people generally interested in the relationship between a more traditional approach to the emergence of Islam and a more historical, critical approach to the emergence of Islam. So even if you're not going to buy the book, you should still watch this episode. So yeah, so Hassan, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on again, Gabriel. It's a pleasure. And yeah, I just really enjoyed working on this book. And I don't know if some of you might remember me from an earlier Q&A episode. So yeah, I help out here with exploring the Quran and the Bible, and we worked on this. Gabriel was nice enough and generous enough to employ me on working on this book. Which was a fantastic opportunity, and I learned a lot. But yeah, Professor, this book, I would encourage everyone who's a serious student of, the Islamic tradition and of the Quran to take a look at it and really look into the book because it has such a breadth of information to offer. And I think the new edition itself is just very updated and sort of incorporates cutting edge research, I think, in the field. So yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm doing great. And yeah, Professor, I thought maybe I could start with asking you sort of the big question on this, which is why did you write this book to begin with?
Yeah, great. Terrific. So yeah, I mean, this was originally written in 2012, first edition of Emergence of Islam. And it's part of a series with Fortress Press. So there's emergence of Judaism and other religious traditions, and including this book, which is the best in the series. But also, this book makes an argument. So I would say two things about like why the book was originally why I took on this project initially that led to the first edition in 2012. One is sort of more like ideological, a little bit controversial, and then the other is more practical. So on the ideological bit, I mean, as far as I know, in terms of textbooks on the emergence, rise of Islam, on Quran and life of the Prophet Muhammad, there's really not another textbook that engages thoroughly with an historical critical method. So, but people know those questions are out there that about, how reliable is this story? How reliable is that story? What is a historical critical approach to the Quran? What elements of the Prophet's traditional biography are like what really happened?
Sure.
And I feel like a lot of the textbooks are out there, and without saying anything bad or mean about anyone else's project, but they sort of just avoid the question, and they just say, "I'm going to follow the traditional narrative." Okay, so that's basically what you find consistently, and that's like, in a way, that's cool. Like that's okay because probably in high school, undergraduate teaching, maybe your first responsibility is to teach that traditional narrative, but not everyone's
Right.
satisfied with that. Some people want to ask the sort of the big question of what really happened. How can we, in a sophisticated manner, read the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, the Hadith, the other literature? So this book uniquely both presents a traditional story and takes a historical critical approach. So that's one. That's sort of the ideological. And then the other thing, just practical, I want to create a volume that would be useful for teachers particularly in undergraduate education, but in principle could be used in secondary high school education. So, I mean, if you just flip through the volume, there's just all sorts of like call out boxes with little features on particular questions or particular historical figures, certain wives of the prophet or companions of the prophet. There's all sorts of images and photos that sort of make the reading easier to digest for an undergraduate student, especially in this.
Good quality photos too, I would say.
Yeah, there's some really excellent ones of inscriptions, archaeological sites, of coins. But then I think a really key feature is at the end of each chapter, there are discussion questions. So it can be easily integrated into a classroom environment where you want to say, okay, let's have some time for small group work. Go through the questions at the end of chapter, whatever. So it's, for pedagogy, I think it's quite useful. So yeah.
Right.
My story.
And then why the new edition? So yeah, I mean, those are all very, very apt descriptions of the book. I would say even more, I would go even further. But why the new edition? What's sort of the new meat in this edition?
Yeah, totally. So the new edition is a response to the like incredibly rapid changes in our knowledge, especially of the historical context of Islam's emergence, and in particular, the new discoveries of inscriptions. At the beginning part of the work, there's engagement in a special way in the preface and the introduction with the work of Ahmed Jalad especially, but others too, who have been going out to Syria, Jordan, and especially Saudi Arabia, and charting and discovering inscriptions and publishing them from the time of the emergence of Islam, so 5th, 6th, 7th centuries.
Sometimes earlier, right?
Yes, certainly with the Safavidic inscriptions, right? Good point. So the Safavidic, ancient North Arabian, well, also ancient South Arabian inscriptions, they stretch back centuries. I have a particular interest in this, what's called the Paleo-Arabic inscriptions that tend to be more 5th, 6th, 7th century for what they say of the changes in we'll speak more about this maybe, but the changes of Arabic self-identity, potentially Arab self-identity, and the changes in the religious context of Arabia at this time. So anyway, that's like been changing rapidly. I mean, it used to be that we knew of like 4 Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, and now we know of dozens of them. We could speak about Paleo-Arabic, what that is, or people could watch the 2 interviews on this channel with Ahmed Jalad. That would be super interesting.
I would highly recommend doing so. Absolutely.
Yeah, he is the expert. And then the other, substantial change is there's an additional chapter at the end, which sort of does a fast forward to the contemporary period and addresses ways in which different Muslim movements from the modern to contemporary periods look at the origins of Islam and the emergence of Islam, and how they have their distinctive narratives, so Salafis. But this new edition engages in a special way with the tradition of South Asian Islam, and in part because as we were working on this in 2021, 2022, the Taliban was emerging again in a robust way in Afghanistan, eventually, of course, emerged victorious in their struggle and established their rule again in Afghanistan. And so the book speaks about, how does the Taliban see the emergence of Islam? How is it related to the larger Deobandi movement of South Asia? What are some of the narratives of Deoband and similar Muslim movements which have certain ideas about Quran and Hadith that frame the way they look at the world today?
Very good. Yeah, right on. Focusing in on these inscriptions then, because that seems to be a lot of the new material here. Could you just comment on those? I know there's 2-part series on this channel with Ahmed Jalad that goes deeper into this, but just as a little bit of an introduction, sort of why are these inscriptions so relevant? What do they say now that we have a large number of them, or a growing number of them maybe? Please.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of points. Maybe the first one to note is that Arabic is an ancient language.
Right.
That doesn't mean that it has an ancient written tradition. in terms of literature. So languages can exist in oral form without having a literature. So, I mean, maybe it's a simple, maybe simplistic point, but just to be clear about that, I mean, some people think that Arabic, because of its linguistic features, is one of the more ancient of the modern Semitic languages, because it has very robust phonology or sound system, and other features of its syntax and the morphology of its words. So Arabic is ancient, right? But it doesn't have a literature before the Quran. We have no like books written down on papyrus or parchment or anything like that, at least known to us, before the Quran. What we do have are inscriptions. Now, the business of inscriptions is really complicated. Again, there's those interviews with Ahmed Jalal.
Yeah.
But so it just some very basic points that the book introduces in a bit more detail is that we have to be very careful to distinguish between ancient North Arabian inscriptions, so pre-Islamic inscriptions known as the ANA, ancient North Arabian, and the ancient South Arabian inscriptions. And the book goes into this, especially in the introduction to part 1. The ancient South Arabian inscriptions represent a different branch, a different language family completely from Arabic. So they're independent languages. There are some modern varieties of them that still exist today in very small numbers. And then ancient North Arabian languages are in fact all related to classical and modern Arabic. So they're in the same language family as Arabic. They're distinguished by their dialectal features and by their scripts. So you have a whole variety of ancient North Arabian scripts that exist going back to well into the BCE or BC period and into the CE or AD period. But something really remarkable happens, which is that, well, two things really. First of all, in both the South and in the North, in the centuries immediately preceding the rise of Islam, the pagan inscriptions disappear. So by the 4th century in South Arabia, basically Yemen and southern Saudi Arabia, by the 4th century, there are no more pagan ancient South Arabian inscriptions. And then something similar happens just a little bit later in the North. So by the 6th century, so the 500s, there are no more pagan ancient North Arabian inscriptions. So we have a whole number of inscriptions, but they're all monotheistic, both in the South and in the North.
That's very interesting. So just a point, maybe, the viewers may be wondering this. So just to be clear, we have pagan inscriptions up until then, around this time.
Tens of thousands of them. I mean, huge numbers of pagan inscriptions.
So it's not merely a question of a lack of evidence. There's a transition that happens in the inscriptions. Exactly.
It's and I mean the sheer numbers of the early pagan inscriptions sort of show that there's a real transition, right? Because you would expect there'd be something. I mean, if paganism, at least pagans were still there and writing inscriptions, we would have found some of them by now from in the North, the 6th century, and in the South, earlier than that. So, I mean, that's really significant. And the inscriptions don't disappear. We do find inscriptions. In focusing on the North now, although ancient Paleo-Arabic inscriptions have also been found in the South. Christian Robin has worked on that in a site called Hima, near Najran in the South. But in any case, these inscriptions also, the Paleo-Arabic inscriptions are all in a script that's recognizable as an earlier form of what the Quran was written in, and what became the standard Arabic script. So, just to make this really clear, so there are two different elements of transition: one, pagan to monotheistic, and then two, a whole variety of scripts that were once used to write the ancient North Arabian inscriptions to one script, which is Paleo-Arabic. It's a form of early Arabic that transitions out of the Nabatean Aramaic script. And this happens before Islam, the transition to the Paleo-Arabic script. So this, I mean, again, Ahmed Jalad is the expert here, and I'm just really, funneling his knowledge in the book. And in whatever I'm saying coherently or incoherently now. I mean, this transition happens 5th, 6th century in ancient North Arabia, where suddenly all of the writer scripts disappear, and what we see is this one Paleo-Arabic script, an early form of the Arabic script, and we see that at the same time the inscriptions are monotheistic. It suggests that, if Islam is sort of a religious revolution beginning in the early 7th century, it suggests there was a revolution before the revolution. Something happened, somewhere around the early 6th, maybe late 5th century, in which it's in part religious but in part cultural, because both the religious nature of the scripts and the actual scripts used, the actual writing systems used for these inscriptions changes dramatically and almost suddenly. That's
remarkable, right? And then you discuss one of these inscriptions in the one in Haran. This is, I think it's just in the beginning here, the introduction to part 1, but it's of a Christian martyr, a certain John, and it's in southern Syria. Could you discuss that? You talk about the religious shift that's going on, a quite dramatic shift, it seems. Is it a Christian one? Do we have evidence for that? Or, is it just general monotheism, whatever that would be? Yeah, maybe if you could say a few things about the Haran inscription.
Great point. So among the northern Paleo-Arabic inscriptions that have been found, and actually including the one studied by Christian Robin in the south at Hima, every inscription that's been found in Paleo-Arabic script, which basically dates it to around the 6th century, can be identified is monotheistic. None of them have any telltale signs of paganism, any mention of pagan gods or goddesses or rituals. And those which can be identified further, in every case, have proven to be Christian. So there's no Paleo-Arabic script which has necessarily been identified as a Jewish inscription. I keep saying inscript when I mean inscription. Everyone just have to bear with me in my interview. Right? There's no inscription that's Paleo-Arabic inscription that has been found which has telltale signs of Judaism. Some of them are just monotheistic and you can't determine further, but those where you can determine further, either because there's an invocation of Christ or because there's a cross or any other Christian feature, those which can be determined further are Christian. And among these is a more sort of monumental inscription, as mentioned on page 6 of the second edition of the book, which is an inscription that's dated to 567 CE, which is dedicated to a Christian martyr, a certain John, not known to us further, which is a bilingual inscription in both Greek and Arabic. And we haven't. This is in Haran in Syria, not in Turkey, but still well to the north of the Hijaz, Mecca, or Medina. There's been other inscriptions found in Syria that are monotheistic and Christian, including one in Zebed, for example, which I believe is trilingual, including Syriac as well, but someone might correct me on that. So, that's another point to be made, that what a careful study of these inscriptions suggests is not a move towards some bland monotheism or some general monotheism, but actually a move towards Christianity, so a Christianization among Arabic speakers that takes place before the rise of Islam.
Right. And if I remember correctly, there's also an inscription studied by Ahmed al-Jalad that was fairly close to the Hijaz itself, right? In the
Hijaz, yeah.
In the Hijaz.
Yes.
Close by Mecca and between, was it Taif and Mecca? Or
Exactly.
Right?
So they've published it just recently. Oh, I think they've maybe published it in an archaeological journal. Maybe someone will find it and put it in the comments here, or maybe we can find it later and put it in the description. But it's at a site called Rih Zalala, and it's been studied and published jointly by Haytham Siddiqui and Ahmed Jalad. It's a general monotheistic inscription, but it's very close. I think it's like 75 kilometers from Mecca, in a place called Sail al-Kabir. I think I might be getting that wrong, but it's a sort of an open space between mountain passes That is a place where if you're coming up, heading northwest from Ta'if, you sort of turn and go southwest to go down towards Mecca. It's sort of the way to avoid all the mountains. And it's a spot where there's a number of inscriptions. And at a certain pass in the mountains leading towards this open space, and Riya Zalala, there's a monotheistic inscription there. So yeah, so there's reason to believe on the basis of inscriptions that the area of Mecca and Medina also experienced this process of transition to monotheism before Islam.
Right. And then how does this bear into the larger argument of the book, maybe? Would you maybe let's go into what some of the main points of the book are, because this sort of it buttresses the argument, but this the argument sort of doesn't change from edition to edition, right? So you're fundamentally arguing the same thing of isolating, in a sense, the Quranic text and some of the theological debates that are happening within from the picture that might be perceived from the later Islamic sources like Ibn Ishaq or Kitab al-Islam or something of that sort. So could you talk about that maybe, and how the inscriptions play into that?
Right. So, I mean, just a general overview of the book is it's divided between section 1 on Muhammad, so that's 3 chapters, section 2 on the Quran, and there's 4 chapters on that, on the Quran, and then a third section, which is just the contemporary period, so that includes only chapter 8. And the section on Muhammad is principally based or dedicated to a presentation of the traditional view of his biography, with some, notes here that actually there's a diversity of opinion on certain things. I mean, for example, the story of the Prophet's night journey and ascension to heaven. Even if we look at the Islamic sources, we have a variety of opinions. Did he really travel, on Buraq, on this miraculous animal to Jerusalem?
Was it a vision?
Exactly. There's a famous hadith of Aisha that the Prophet journeyed there in spirit, but not in body, etc., etc. So, yeah, but the first part of the book is basically dedicated to a traditional portrayal of Muhammad's life. And the second part of the book is an examination of the Quran. So chapter 4 is sort of a simple, straightforward presentation of the Quran and its message. But then in what follows in chapters 5 and 6 and 7, I look at the Quran in its relationship to the Bible, the Quran in its relationship to the biography of the Prophet. And then that leads to chapter 7, which rethinks the historical context of the Quran. So this second part of the book basically is the enterprise of saying, okay, what is the Quran itself? How can the Quran itself be a guide to the context in which Islam emerges? And it's here that the connection is found between the inscriptions and between the argument of the book and the evidence of the Quran, because the Quran itself engages thoroughly, robustly, and consistently with competing monotheisms, namely Judaism and Christianity. It does this in those passages traditionally known as Medinan, and those passages traditionally known as Meccan. Sort of Maryam is a Meccan surah by tradition, which tells a story actually in conversation with certain earlier Christian traditions of the Annunciation and Nativity, and then childhood miracles of Jesus, and many other places Christian material is engaged with in the Meccan material. So, I mean, the Quran itself suggests that there are Christians around, and it's concerned with Christians and Christianity, also with Jews, which, I mean, the Quran, this is sort of a classical problem for scholars of early Islam. You read the biography and you find no Christians in Mecca or Medina, and Jews only in Medina. And then you read the Quran and you find Judaism and Christianity everywhere, and a deep and abiding concern with the challenge of Judaism and Christianity. So it doesn't seem to match up. And there are different strategies. Sorry?
Oh, pardon. Sorry. I think Nikolai Sinai called it once the Christian elephant in the Meccan room, right? It's a funny way of putting it,
Yes,
but
yes,
yeah, very much
I think
so.
he has the talk of that title. It's circling around the internet. So, I mean, one way traditionally to solve this problem is to find wandering Christians here and there, to look through the biography and get a story of, oh, well, the first migration was to Ethiopia, and Ethiopia was Christian, or Muhammad used to travel to Syria. But that doesn't really solve the problem, because the Quran is not just transmitting Christian traditions. It is doing that, but it's engaging with Christians all around it. I mean, we even have verses in the Quran which speak in a positive way of monasteries and churches and possibly synagogues. There's a word there, salawat, that may mean synagogues. So it's engaging with monks in a way that suggests monks are reality in its context. I mean, think of Quran chapter 5, verse 82, which it describes monks of being humble and praises them. And that's the reason for which Christians are closest in affection to the believers. Anyway, so the book basically says the Quran itself points us to major surprises when it comes to Islam's emergence, namely that there are monotheists around. And this happens to match what we're finding in the inscriptions.
What would you say to putting the inscriptions aside for a moment, because I think they changed this debate a bit, but what would you say to someone who says, well, there are Christians in the traditional sources? There's Waraka and Bahira and, the Christians from Najran, and maybe you mentioned Abyssinia, that, well, there are monks in the biography and in the traditional sources. So couldn't these just explain this material? And is there really so much of a contradiction, or maybe if that's not the right word, a tension between the traditional biographical or historical materials and what we find in the Quran, or maybe looking forward a bit, the inscriptions?
Well, yeah, terrific question. I think there's a sort of straightforward answer, and then there's a more speculative, adventurous answer. So I'll give both. Sure. Straightforward answer is, and I already alluded to this in part, but I mean, the Quran is not only transmitting Christian traditions, but it's engaging directly with Christians. So a number of verses could be cited, but for example, Quran, Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, when the Quran says, Ya Ahl al-Kitab, la taghlu fi dinukum wa la taqulu ala Allah illa al-haq, O people of the book, do not go to excess in your deen, whatever deen might mean, maybe religion, and do not say anything but the truth about God. And then it goes on to make certain statements about Jesus. It's obviously engaging with Christians and Christian doctrine about Jesus. When the Quran says that the people of the book say, I think it's the Jews and the Christians say, we are the children of Abraham and we are the children of God and his beloved, say, then why does he punish you for your sins? The Quran is obviously engaging with Jews and Christians that is around. And then in a more positive vein, in Surah Al-Ankabut 29, the Quran says, so do not debate with the people of the book except in the best way. So it suggests there's debating going on with the Jews and Christians. And actually that verse, including the so-called common word verse in Surah 3, goes on and makes certain claims which probably have Christianity in mind, although not explicitly. So, I mean, so that's a straightforward answer. The Quran is concerned not just with Christian traditions, but with Christians and lived Christian communities. Quran 57 has a positive statement about Christians, and then maybe a negative statement about monasticism. There are many things to point to. Okay, the more adventurous answer is, I would suggest, and this is not really in this book. This book is not that adventurous. It's much more straightforward. But I would suggest that there are ways in which the Quran's own theological articulations are advanced with Christianity in mind. Judaism too, obviously Judaism is a real part of this story, but I think there are ways in which the Quran, when it's expressing its own theology, it's concerned with Christian claims. I mean, I think it's possible that this is seen in the Basmala, this tripartite formulation. Why does the Quran have a tripartite formulation? I'm not claiming that it's actually a veiled Trinitarian reference, but that it has its own tripartite formulation, whereas in Christian liturgy, the invocation of the triune God as Father, Son, and Spirit is everywhere. And then the Quran places everywhere except for one chapter, its tripartite formulation. I think that in some ways, the Quran's concern with divine transcendence, not only in places where it explicitly says that God does not take a walad, but also its general insistence on the sublimity of God is perhaps a way of responding to the Christian doctrine of the incarnation or the divinity of Christ. So, everyone, when they advance a conversation or carry out a conversation, they tend to be, even you and I, tend to be aware of our conversation partner, and we might articulate things differently depending on the conversation partner. So as I said, this latter point, it's harder to prove, a bit more speculative, but I think we can probably make the case that the Quran is in a straightforward way is engaging with Christians, and potentially in a less noticeable, more sort of symbolic way, responding to Christian claims.
Right. And then this, especially the latter, but even the former would imply much more than a, wandering monastic in his cell, or,
Yes. And one more thing, Hassan,
straight-haired.
sorry to be
Yeah,
so
please.
petty and to cut you off, but I mean, on this latter point as well are the uses of biblical turns of phrase.
Right.
And noticeably, the Quran does not employ biblical turns of phrase in the way that the Bible does. When the Quran speaks about a camel in the eye of the needle, it's not speaking about a rich man in chapter 7 in the Quran. It's speaking about someone who denies the signs of God. When the Quran speaks about a mustard seed, it's not speaking about the kingdom of God. It's speaking about, as it is in the Gospels, it's speaking about the microscopic reach of divine judgment. And many other examples of biblical turns of phrase, which just suggest this language was like saturated in the air in the context of the Quran.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then where does this take us in terms of an assessment of the sort of biographic or historical sources in the later Islamic tradition, moving into maybe another element of the book that highlights the exegetical quality of some of these sources? Could you speak about that?
Right. I mean, a fundamental point to be made, and it's not a new one, so it's not mine, is that very often stories known as asbab an-nuzul, and even stories which are not, so that means occasions of revelation, stories which give the occasion on which God revealed a certain passage of the Quran, even other related reports, akhbar, very often these reports seem to be responding to the Quran. So the Quran doesn't seem to be responding to a historical event remembered in the report, but the reports seem to be responding to the Quran. So, I mean, almost every, the famous Belgian scholar Henri Lamens felt that everything in the biography could be explained this way. I wouldn't go that far. There's definitely other elements in the biography. But I mean, for example, we have a passage in the Quran in two places, in chapter 2 and chapter 4, in which the Israelites are made to say, our hearts are ghulf, usually understood to mean uncircumcised or closed. And then we have a story, it's found in the tafsirs, but can be found elsewhere, that Muhammad was preaching to the Jews of Medina, and they responded, our hearts are ghulf. And so this makes this even more intriguing, because there's a reading variant to ghulf, which is ghuluf, 2 syllables, which means containers. And then there's another story that matches that reading variant, in which Muhammad's in Medina preaching to the Jews, and the Jews said, we won't listen to you. Our hearts already contain all knowledge because we have the Torah. Right. So, I mean, with these sorts of bits, and we could even go to the famous story of Muhammad on Mount Hira, when his first revelation came, and the relationship between that story and the first 5 verses of Surah Al-Alaq, chapter 96 of the Quran. These stories, sort of lead us to ask the question whether did Muhammad really preach, and did the Jews really respond this way in the streets of Medina? Did this story really happen with Muhammad on the mountain in Mount Hira? Or were those stories written by later Muslim scholars as a way of explaining material in the Quran? In which case those stories would be exegetical, or sometimes people like to use the phrase midrashic, exegetical. So
especially in their details, maybe, especially in their particular details. You and Sean Anthony have discussed this. I think also Nikolai Sinai in 2 interviews on this channel. I would encourage everyone to take a look at those as well. but yeah, especially a lot of the details that we find in these.
Yeah, and the key point, I want to say two more things about this briefly.
Yeah,
One
please.
thing is that the key point is not that supernatural events can be excluded from the biography, like maybe the night journey or the splitting of the moon or something, and you're left with a solid historical core.
Sure.
That's not the point. The point is the relationship between the reports and the Quran, where the reports are by nature exegetical and therefore later than the Quran, and not memories of things as they really were. This doesn't mean Muhammad didn't exist. I'm not a radical revisionist that Muhammad didn't exist. It just means let's take the relationship between the Quran and these reports seriously and see what their literary relationship is. And then something else is that that the book gets into a little bit is that there's a habit among some scholars of filtering through the reports, not according to what is supernatural or miraculous, but according to what either makes Muhammad look good or look bad. And I don't know if you want to talk about this a little bit, but so people effectively, when they do that, they're opening up the question of, okay, you've just eliminated these reports because they make Muhammad either look bad or good, but why are you accepting the other ones?
Right. I think you write here on page 77 with reference to William Montgomery Watt and some of those who would demonize Muhammad, that all of these approaches, however, miss the basic problem of Muhammad's biography, which is, as you've said here, the exegetical nature of a number of the stories.
Yeah, Watt has this statement that I quote in the book, which would probably make people's skin crawl today, because he says, was Muhammad a good man according to the standards of the Arabia of his day? And then he would answer to that, yes. And then he says, was he a good man according to the standards of, say, the best people in Europe about the year 1950? Which I didn't know that people that had reached at that time and place the pinnacle of civilization and culture. But there he basically says, no, like he was good for his time, but not good for our time. We've gotten better. People wouldn't like that anymore. But I mean, a larger point is that, someone, even in the believing community, there's debates upon this among different sorts of Muslims. Some who would have a more progressive take would want to eliminate certain traditions from the biography because they make Muhammad look less progressive. And others with maybe a more Salafi or literalist take would want to keep those in because the scripture has authority, the hadith have authority. So this book, at least the historical critical part of it, the second part of it, sort of steps outside of that Muhammad good or bad question entirely. That's not what's at stake. What's at stake is the literary relationship between the Quran and the traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the key insights of the book, and something that really struck me as you were arguing through it, just the number of the number of stories in the biography that take this sort of shape. I think you mentioned the delegation from Najran, the question. There's also a variant with whether it's you will not be asked, or do not ask, right? That produces two different explanations in the exegetical sources. So yeah, I would say very well argued here. And I think the nuance is important that you mentioned as well, that this doesn't necessarily take us to zero in terms of approaching the historical Muhammad, or approaching something around in our approach to the early Islamic sources in history. But we have to be critical. We have to think critically about the nature and relationship of these sources. And I think that's a very, very well said and necessary takeaway. Professor, I wanted to move on a bit here to the later part of this book, chapter 8, which I think stands apart to some degree from what came before it. Not to say it's very intelligently thematically related, but it does stand apart a bit, and that's the contemporary Muslim narratives of Islam's emergence and contemporary movements within Islam. And I think you discuss a few new things that you've mentioned, the Taliban, progressive Islam. Would you mind just elaborating a little bit of why you chose to incorporate these new elements?
Right. So, I mean, the short answer to the why is because, the book, even if its principal goal is to introduce the emergence of Islam, especially for undergraduate students, people ask questions about, in my classes here at Notre Dame all the time, about Islam today and Muslims today. What do Muslims think about this or that? And, the constant demand upon us is to introduce to our students the diversity of contemporary Islam, just to remind them that there are all sorts of currents of thought. There are different takes on Islamic law and Islamic practice and the scope of Islam, the relationship between Islam and politics, and a million other questions. I was speaking with my students recently about Muslim Americans in dating. And
Right.
what are Muslim leaders and influencers in the U.S. scene saying about relationships between men and women before marriage, all of this. So I want the book to accomplish some of that as well. So as you noted, thank you for that. The book introduces everything from the Taliban to progressive Muslims. There's
The full breadth.
there's a photo there of Laleh Bakhtiar, the Quran translator,
Yeah.
who famously reinterpreted or retranslated the statement of Quran 434, usually understood to mean beating one's wives, in a very different way, as just leaving them in peace. So she very much represents a more progressive take. The story of South Asian Islam was particularly interesting to me, because here you have a context where two different strands of very pious, very devotional Islam, so that usually understood as the Barelvi and the Deobandi movements, emerge and are still, enormously important movements in South Asian Islam and in the South Asian diaspora today. But that's sort of a case study between those who have different approaches to the sources. Both the Barelvis and Deobandis, they take the Quran and Hadith seriously, but they have different ideas about the role of the Prophet and what is permissible, the notion of what is bid'ah, what is innovation, and what is permissible in Islamic daily life. And the extreme form of the Deobandi movement takes shape with the Taliban, who, of course, famously, consider many things to be forbidden, from pastimes, but also certain religious practices, to things that a woman can or can't do. And along the way, we start with the chapter actually starts with Ibn Taymiyyah, so way back earlier in the late Middle Ages, and goes on to Sayyid Qutb, a famous Egyptian. And there's some fun in the book with Sayyid Qutb's visit to Colorado in the late 1940s, and the shock that he had at American society in the 1940s. And I just wonder, if he found American 1940s shocking, what would it be like if he came back in 2023 when we're recording this?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting thought experiment, I would say.
Yeah. And part of the book too, in chapter 8, is meant to also sort of inspire Western students, college students, to just keep in mind how deeply religious not everyone, you don't want to exaggerate or generalize, but much of the Muslim majority world is. Just introduce them to that. The West has become so a-religious or irreligious that it's difficult for students sometimes to even imagine what it's like to live in a religious society, to have a religious view of the world, where what matters is not only your responsibility to your fellow humans, but also your responsibility to God. And what are the consequences for having that view and taking that seriously? How does that affect the way you see your own moral, ethical choices, the role of a society, the role of a government, and all of that?
Right. And it does so really well. I want to note one more thing, just to discuss before we end here. You discuss scientific miracles in the Quran and the work of Maurice Bucaille, and I think I said that right.
I always say Bucaille,
French. I don't.
I've never heard Bucaille say it himself. So.
Oh, right. But a very famous French doctor who wrote a book called The Quran and the Bible in Light of Modern Science, I think, if I got that right. Very, very well, widespread, rather, book. And could you discuss that as well, how these like different currents you see, you know, be it progressive Islam, modern Islamic movements that really are trying to be sort of scientific or sort of reinterpret the Quran in light of science, or
Totally. Yeah,
vice versa.
there's a lot of attention at the end towards apologetics or dawah, or evangelization, Muslim evangelization, if we can use that term. Yeah, so, and I think it's interesting to note that in 20th, 21st century, you have a movement both on questions of science and questions of morality. So there are works, and, you know, for example, the work of Naguib Mahfouz, quite open liberal thinker, but nevertheless, in his novel, The Children of Biali, or The Children of Gebelawi, he, you know, makes a case that Muhammad, who's Qasim in the novel, represents sort of a perfect mean between the severity of Moses and the laxity of Jesus. So on moral questions, there's this response, implicit response to Christian criticisms, missionary criticisms of Muhammad's ethics. And then we see something very similar happening with science. So this is, to me, a distinctly modern thing. In the Middle Ages, even the late Middle Ages, people are not making the case that, oh, the Quran has scientific miracles that wouldn't have been known in the 7th century, are only known to us now in the 16th century or 17th century. It just doesn't exist at all. But we have this modern response to the crisis of modernity, where people in the late 19th, early 20th century begin making the case that, okay, you think you're so great, Westerners, because you have science. Actually, the Quran has these miracles. And then most famously, as you say, Maurice Bucaille writes his book, which just becomes a celebrity. I mean, it's like Maurice Bucaille, in terms of dawah, Maurice Bucaille and Ahmed Didat are the two stars of the 20th century. And maybe Gospel Barnabas gets an honorable mention too, because it was translated into Arabic, I think, by Rashid Ridda in the early 20th century. So there's even a screenshot in the book of a scientific miracle website that shows, you know, shows here some what some of those websites look like, and claims that the Quran has this miraculous scientific knowledge. I mean, maybe now is not the time to get into that argument, but there are interesting counter arguments to this notion. And of course, many Muslims who would say this is not the right way to approach a 7th century text.
Right. I just think it goes to show the breadth of the book, which, you know, starts with inscriptions, the traditional biography, then moves into, you know, the Quran, its relationship with biblical material, and then, you know, you get all the way to you know, Maurice Bucaille and you know, modern contemporary movements. It's such an expansive book. And yeah, Professor Reynolds, thank you for giving me the opportunity to work on it with you and discussing it here. And I encourage everyone to take a look at it. And there's a lot to learn, especially if you're a serious student who you know, is still somewhat at an introductory level, or wants to really get an idea of you know, sort of the expansive nature of Islam and Islamic history, and the key debates that run through it. I would certainly recommend The Emergence of Islam.
Thank you so much, Hassan. It's not a perfect book, but hopefully there's something in there useful for anyone interested in Islam, both in its emergence and in contemporary Islam. Thank you also, Hassan, for your help with the book. You caught many errors, but also contributed new insights in our discussions as we were working on the 2nd edition. And yeah, thanks for your help with exploring the Quran and the Bible, and for this chat.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Gabriel.